Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and hosting me. And I hope that this session will be of some value. The title that I was given for this session, "Freedom and Responsibilities of Media," there's an add-on to it, is "Within an Islamic State." And this, whoever came up with this session itself, they must have read this paper. It's a paper that I delivered 12 years ago here in Malaysia, in KL, at a conference with Professor Naqib's son, Ali Tawfiq. We were on the same panel. So you'll please forgive me. I'm going to read from it. When I got the subject, I thought, oh my God, it was 12 years ago I wrote something like this, and really haven't given it that much thought because I'm doing other things. So I reread the paper, and it's probably even more relevant now than it was 12 years ago. So just to kick off the session, I'm going to read parts of it to give you an idea of where I stand on this, and where I think we are as a community of believers. In late 1977, I was in Los Angeles, California, with the late Sheikh Al-Azhar, Dr. Abdul Halim Mahmoud, at a press conference he gave within days of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's historic visit to Jerusalem, which was, as you all know, hailed in the West and reviled across the Arab and Islamic world. At the press conference, the reporter from Time magazine asked him, "Do you think that America could become a Muslim country?" Without missing a beat, he answered, "Why not? Islam is the way of God and peace. Americans believe in God and in peace." Today, that question would never be asked, ever. And the answer would be met by outrage and revulsion. Islam has become anathema to the non-Islamic world and a source of internal conflict for Islamic states, and this has a lot to do with the failure of communications. Since that time, we've seen a frightening and tragic deterioration of communications that has led to the alteration of the image of Islam from a way of benign spirituality, forbearance, and purification into a strident and threatening political ideology. We have seen the rise of intolerant, xenophobic, heretical, and suicidally murderous extremism. We have seen a mass confusion among ordinary Muslims as to how to reconcile modern life with the practice of their faith. We have seen the wholesale disenfranchisement of Muslim youth from traditional forms of Islam. We have seen the continuing isolation of several Islamic states from global society. We have seen a prevailing fear and loathing of Islam and Muslims throughout the non-Islamic world. And I'm sorry to say that this miserable state of affairs can be largely attributed to the dangerous and widening rift between the media and the institutions of Islam. Now, when I wrote that 12 years ago, it's worse now than ever. Now, in the 1970s, when Sheikh Al-Azhar was in Los Angeles, nobody knew anything about Islam. There was no prejudice against Islam. It was an unknown factor. The Palestinian crisis or situation was not characterized in religious terms. It was the Arab-Israeli war. It was an ethnic conflict. Now it's been religified somehow. So we're today, in the age of Trump and the age of Brexit and the age of all the of Modi and all everything that's going on, Islam is becoming further and further away from from the mainstream. It's been utterly polarized. We're in trouble here. And a big part of the problem has been with the way that the Muslims, the Muslim leaders and the Muslim ulama have reacted or not reacted. And I'm afraid that very little has been done to correct this. It's some things have been done, and I'd like to go over some of that, which is slightly hopeful, but it's very, very slow. So just to continue, we are, to be perfectly blunt, in one holy mess. The irony, of course, is that we have never had access to more information or a wider and more diverse media environment than we have today. And with the advent of what in my business we call new media, that's what we were calling it 12 years ago, that is to say digital interactive media, or what the telecoms people are now calling seamless mobility. Again, these are all terms that are gone. We can link in anytime, anywhere to other worlds in ways and with speeds that would have been completely inconceivable less than 15 years ago. Yet, and again, now it would be less than 25 years ago. Yet, we are living in a global society as conflicted, confused, and insecure as it is interconnected. And much of this conflict, confusion, and insecurity in Muslim societies and in Muslim communities in non-Islamic societies can be attributed to the chasm that separates Islam from the media. On the one hand, religious scholars have absolutely failed to adapt to the modern world. This is a problem. It's a big problem. There are some attempts, and I'll mention a couple of situations that I know about. Islam is still being interpreted and taught based upon medieval paradigms that bear no relation to the world we live in. And while there is no question that the pervasiveness of media has had a profound transformative impact on the world we live in, religious scholars and institutions of religious learning have utterly failed to cope with or respond to this powerful force in any positive way, nor have they made any effort to understand how mass media works. On the other hand, journalism and mass media have emerged out of an aggressively secular, sometimes revolutionary, and ultimately subversive modern tradition that exalts freedom of speech and expression above all else, including religious belief and practice. In most Islamic societies, journalists have no qualification to write or comment upon Islam or Islamic issues, whereas in many developed parts of the world, a journalist might have a PhD in his field. In Muslim countries, the same reporter who covers public or social affairs or business news will be allowed to comment upon a religious issue or juristic decision without any qualification whatsoever. At the same time, institutionalized Islam has not only lost touch with the modern world, it has also lost touch with its own roots. Now, I'm not talking about my esteemed company here, because I think that you're on to something. But as you all know, throughout much of the Muslim world, this is a huge problem. And when I'm talking about the roots, when I say roots, I mean the roots of classical knowledge. This is not a new phenomenon. In the 14th century, Imam al-Ghazali, in Ihya Ulumuddin, described how the meanings of the praiseworthy sciences had been reduced and degraded to such an extent that they had become blameworthy, and the first such science he mentions is fiqh. According to al-Ghazali, and I quote, "In the early period of Islam, the term fiqh applied to the science of the path of the hereafter and the knowledge of the subtle defects of the soul, the influences which render works corrupt, the thorough realization of the inferiority of this life and the urgent expectation of bliss in the hereafter, and the domination of fear over the heart." But al-Ghazali contended the meaning of fiqh had been reduced to what he says, what he quotes is the knowledge of unusual legal cases, the mastery of the minute details of their origins, excessive disputation on them, and retention of the different opinions which relate to them. And I think also we have the same problem with kalam. I'll give you a recent example. About a year and a half or 2 years ago, I attended a conference on kalam in Cambridge. And it was attended by many close friends of mine who I love and admire, who are mutakallimin. And it was unspeakably boring. It was just, one of my friends was falling asleep and everyone was just, it was they're very clever, they know. And there was a great sheikh of tasawwuf who was also present in the room, and he was very quiet and very polite. And he only attended the first day. And after the first day, when he was leaving the room, one of his followers said, "Well, what did you think?" He said, "It's people talking about things they don't understand, And this is a problem. We have taken on Western paradigms for learning, so that we pour things into the head that we don't know, and that's partially necessary. But and I think this is what you're after, is an integrated approach to learning, so that you have the inward and you have the outward. You have the study of science, but the study of science to know the self, to know God. And so it's a process. Anyway, we're in this really difficult period. According to Al-Ghazali, the reduction of the practice of fiqh created confusion that caused scholars to devote themselves solely to abstruse legal opinions to, and I quote, the neglect of the science of the hereafter and the nature of the heart. He wrote, "Upon my life, the word fiqh and the word fahm are nothing but two names for the same thing." You may ask why I'm dwelling on this issue when I'm supposed to be speaking on the media, okay? And I'll tell you. Now, this was 12 years ago, okay? So I said, last week, I went to the global internet search engine, Google, and typed in the word fatwa. Do you have any idea how many entries there are for this word, or there were at that time for this? 4,780,000 entries, and almost every single entry refers to terrorism or intolerance. If you log on to Google Images and type in fatwa, nearly every image at that point was linked to Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, terrorism, or violence. And if you think that this has no relevance to the issue of media and Islam, then you're living on another planet. This is what's affecting us everywhere we go, wherever we turn. And what are the Muslim scholars doing about this? Well, from all evidence, making things worse. Okay? I'm sorry to be very blunt, but I think this is the case. And in rereading this, I thought, well, maybe things have changed. And I looked at it and I said, no, it's actually worse. It's not better. There are isolated people who are trying to do something, but they're crying out in the wilderness. They're very few. And then what I did, and I don't know if I'll go into all, it's actually amazing, and I don't know. In the last month, we've had two grotesque and embarrassing controversies. And when I say the last month, that was 12 years ago. Okay. Controversies ignited by opinions delivered by qualified religious scholars from one of the world's greatest and most authoritative institutions of Islamic learning that hit the headlines and raged through the Arab and Islamic media, spilling out into the global media, thus further undermining the image of Islam in the West and the authority of Islamic institutions in the Muslim world. If one wanted to dream up ways to discredit Islamic authority, you couldn't come up with two more damaging news items. The first and most outrageous of the two controversies revolved around an opinion given by Dr. Izzat Atiyah, the head of the Hadith department in Al-Azhar University's Usuluddin faculty. During an interview in Al-Gumhuriyya newspaper, Dr. Atiyah gave an opinion that a woman who is required to work in private with a man not of her immediate family, a situation that is widespread across the Islamic world and technically forbidden by Islamic law, can resolve the problem by breastfeeding the adult man, which, according to his interpretation of Sharia, turns him into a member of her immediate family. He supported this opinion. I'm sorry, I'm breaking. It's just so absurd. I can't. He supported this opinion by citing an obscure hadith referring to a unique situation that in the history of Islam had never, ever been invoked as the basis of a legal ruling. He said, being together in private means being in a room with the door closed so that no one can see them. A man and a woman who are not family members are not permitted to do this because it raises suspicions and doubts. A man and a woman who are alone together are not necessarily having sex, but this possibility exists, and breastfeeding provides a solution to this problem. I also insist that the breastfeeding relationship be officially documented in writing. The contract will state that this woman has suckled this man. I mean, it's... I still can't, I can't believe I'm reading this still. After this, the woman may remove her hijab and expose her hair to the man's presence. Of course, he failed to address the fact that a woman exposing her breasts to an unrelated adult male in the first place would be a far greater violation of Sharia than exposing her hair. It's insane. It's completely insane. This was the head of Usul al-Fiqh. Needless to say, the Egyptian press had a field day with this. And Egypt being Egypt, the story launched an avalanche of salacious jokes around the country. Then, of course, there was the inevitable, absurd, but completely serious follow-up debate among some commentators and religious scholars on the use of the breast pump, which led to another barrage of jokes and ridicule. The jokes were ultimately translated into a series of cartoons that circulated through the email and on the internet. And I actually, at the conference, I showed them. And I said, please, anyone who's, sensitive, you can lower your eyes. Because they were disgusting, obscene. So now the reason I showed these cartoons was not to titillate or shock, but to underscore the fact that an ill-advised religious opinion, and I'm being polite here, delivered via the mass media can create an ugly blowback that elicits the haram rather than the halal, no matter how pious the original intention. It also demonstrates the powerful, interactive aspect of public discussion in our time. The mass media and the new media have become a fact of life and a major force, and scholars and religious institutions that choose to ignore this reality do so at their own peril. The media demonstrated gross irresponsibility in giving this bizarre opinion so many column inches. And Dr. Atiyah demonstrated gross irresponsibility by issuing the opinion in the first place and then staunchly defending himself in a national newspaper, ending his defense by saying, and I quote, "The fact that the hadith regarding the breastfeeding of an adult is inconceivable to the mind does not make it invalid. This is a reliable hadith, and rejecting it is tantamount to rejecting Allah's messenger and questioning the Prophet's tradition." Now let's please recall what Al-Ghazali said about the purpose and meaning of fiqh. Here's this idiot, he's an idiot. I don't care if he has a doctorate or what he has. He's an idiot. He's saying something is completely incomprehensible, but you've got to follow it. And because he said it, it's a fatwa. This is ridiculous. And this is what there are a lot of people like that out there, as I'm sure you're very aware. Personally, I find Atiya's defense more offensive than the original opinion. It is this kind of religious totalitarianism that is completely contrary to the spirit of Islam and is undermining the trust intelligent people have in these institutions, and is an indication of just how hidebound and blind Islamic scholarship has become. Apart from anything else, he's missing the point. Whether the hadith is true or not is completely irrelevant, because the action is absolutely inapplicable, not to say abominable, in this age. Moreover, this demonstrates how disconnected this particular scholar is from the realities of global media. And he's not just some nut standing on a street corner. He was the head of hadith studies at a major Islamic university. Whereas in ancient traditional societies, an eccentric opinion from a relatively obscure muhaddith would most certainly have been confined to a small circle of students and then superseded by saner voices. In the world we inhabit, and particularly given the precarious situation the Islamic world is in at the moment, delivering this opinion in the mass media is idiotic, and then defending it is obscene. And I think we can legitimately ask how it is that Al-Azhar University, one of the most venerable and respected religious institutions in the Islamic world, would allow someone so patently out of touch with the realities of this world to teach Islam to young people. This is the ivory tower. What's going on? He has no understanding, and he's not even using his intellect properly, you know. Anyway, he was removed from his post, but by that time the damage had been done, and this thing had spread across the world into the Western media, and of course, Islam was once again a laughing stock and painted as something backward, and you know. While the breastfeeding fiasco demonstrates the profound and dangerous weakness of Islamic scholarship in our time, the second controversy I'll address demonstrates the ignorance, incompetence, and irresponsibility of much of the Arab and Islamic media. This is the now notorious urine fatwa. Do you remember this? Supposedly issued by the Grand Mufti of Egypt, Dr. Ali Goma. Before his appointment as Grand Mufti, Dr. Goma was the highly popular khatib in the historic Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo and gave well-attended discourses after every Jummah prayer. During one of these discourses, he was asked about the veracity of an obscure hadith about a woman companion who carried the chamber pot of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and once drank its contents for the blessing. He affirmed that the hadith was true, commenting that according to the Sharia, Allah created all the Anbiya absolutely pure, to the extent that everything coming from them was pure, and that this act was a sign of this woman companion's extreme love of the Prophet Muhammad. He did not issue a fatwa, because a fatwa is a call to action in the world we live in now. And the Prophet Muhammad, no longer being in this world, had no urine for anyone else to drink. Moreover, in the greater context of scholarship, there is no other single report of any other companion ever doing this, or the practice ever being recommended. Unfortunately, Dr. Goma allowed this and other discourses to be recorded, transcribed, and compiled into books which were subsequently published. And years later, a self-described Islamic writer, which means someone who has no qualification to write about Islam, dredged up this obscure exchange and used it to attack the Grand Mufti as part of a smear campaign to undermine the reforms Dr. Goma had been calling for. a reporter from the Egyptian daily Al-Masri Al-Yom picked up the complaint and, without contacting Dar al-Iftah or verifying his facts, published a story describing Dr. Goma's comments on the hadith as a fatwa on the spiritual benefits of drinking the Prophet's urine. Once again, the press jumped all over this urine fatwa story without bothering to refer to the mufti or check the facts. The Egyptian joke masters worked overtime. The bloggers went to town, and urine hit the headlines along with breastfeeding. Dr. Goma issued a statement calling on the press to desist from the discussion as totally useless and irrelevant, and that he was withdrawing the book because it was diverting people from more important issues. The press completely ignored him and kept on the story until it too reached the global media, resulting in the International Herald Tribune headline, "A fatwa free-for-all in the Islamic world." While all this was happening, the Majmu' Buhuth al-Islami, the highest united Islamic authority in Egypt, issued a groundbreaking religious decision that, according to the Sharia, women could serve as judges in courts of law, because up till then, women had been prohibited from serving as judges in Egypt and many other Muslim countries. And this decision echoed and upheld a fatwa previously delivered by the Grand Mufti, by Dr. Goma. Was this landmark decision covered? Yes, once, in one newspaper. The breastfeeding and urine controversies were given massive and repeated coverage for weeks on end in every single mass circulation publication in Egypt and many abroad. This is yellow journalism, no pun intended, at its most degraded. While all this has been happening, we have witnessed a descent into collective madness with atrocities, decapitations, car bombings, suicide bombings, hostage-taking, and mass murder of innocents in the name of Islam taking place repeatedly across the world stage, in Muslim countries and in non-Islamic countries. Has there been a resounding repudiation of extremism and its many horrors from a unified community of Islamic scholars? The answer is no. Now, having said that, there has been a collective, and I think a consensus that all this is haram. But after 9/11, there was not a unified repudiation or condemnation of this from Islamic scholars. There wasn't. There were isolated a few people saying this is wrong. And many of them were saying, well, in the West they do all these terrible things to the Muslim. But that's not the point. And it's a misunderstanding of how media works as well. And so things have gotten a little better, but it's too little too late. The damage has been done. I'll give you one last example of the current situation. Last year, again, that would have been 2006, during the now infamous Danish cartoon controversy, the Grand Mufti of Egypt delivered a landmark fatwa published on the pages of Al-Ahram newspaper, calling on the Muslims to desist from protest and reaction, citing, among other things, the Quranic verse, "So overlook with gracious forgiveness, for we are sufficient unto you against the mockers, even against those who adopt with God another God, but soon they will come to know. We do indeed know how your heart is distressed at what they say, but glorify your Lord with his praise, and be of those who prostrate and worship your Lord until what is certain comes to you." Did the fatwa have any impact? Not a bit. It was entirely overlooked by the media and the general public. Why? It was overlooked by the public because the opinion was delivered after 8 long expository paragraphs in a newspaper. In journalistic terms, the Grand Mufti buried the lead. Okay? It was overlooked by the press because there is not a single journalist around qualified to cover Islam or recognize a truly important Islamic news development. I mean, a good journalist would look at that and say, my God, this is brilliant. But no, people lost their lives over this stupid and embarrassing protest. Images of Muslim demonstrators calling for death to the infidels on the streets of London were broadcast around the world, once again reinforcing the impression that Muslims were fanatical barbarians. And all these hysterical reactions were in violation of the Quran. In absence of a credible religious authority in the mass media, there has been what may be the most insidious development of the last half-century, the rise of popular Islamist, unquote, writers and journalists who are not qualified to interpret Islamic practice or law, yet who through the power of words have set themselves up as religious authorities and turned Islam into a seductive, radicalized political ideology, more in common with Marxism than the way of Muhammad, that has formed the foundation of the violent, heretical, and extremist movements that have wreaked havoc across the world and turned Islamic states into outcast societies. The clash between institutions of information and institutions of religious learning has created a catastrophic vacuum and wave of confusion throughout Muslim populations that must be urgently redressed. It is time, in my opinion, for qualified scholars, and I don't mean just academics with book learning, but true ulama, possessed of the knowledge of the heart and the hereafter and personal purity, wisdom, and practice, to back up their formal knowledge, to seize the authority that has been usurped by extremists, Islamic writers, and Islamic activists with no qualifications to guide people on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. To do this, they have to accept the fact that they live in a world inundated with media, and they must enthusiastically learn how to use contemporary communications tools. And it's time for the media in Islamic states to mature to the point that we have a body of journalists truly qualified to comment upon and write about Islamic issues. They have to stop giving voice to any Tom, Dick, or Harry, or any Usama, Ayman, or Maulana Abdullah to deliver extremist declarations and incitements. It's time for Islamic scholars to come together to universally condemn terrorism and the murder of innocents and non-combatants without exception. This failure to condemn terrorism as a community has become a major issue within Western societies who are now afraid of their own immigrant Muslim populations, and has led to racial profiling and other defensive measures, and has marginalized Muslim scholars from mainstream thought. The media should be free to report on, critique, and make commentary on contemporary religious issues, but by the same token, they have the responsibility to make their reports and critiques from a position of knowledge. The responsibility of the media in Islamic states should be to report and comment on what is important, not what is controversial. In reporting on Islam, the press needs to overcome its culture of controversy. Understanding and clarity should take precedence over sensationalism. They have to stop jumping on every emotional bandwagon that passes by. We need to bring the media and religious institutions closer together. Scholars occupying public positions must be media trained and should be educated in both the diversity of media and the ways in which it can best be used. It is high time that we produce specialists in religious reporting. I recommend that major institutions of religious learning introduce courses on transmitting Islam through electronic, broadcast, and print media taught by media professionals. And finally, pious Muslims must overcome their prejudices against the two most powerful and influential media on earth, the cinema and television. And as their forefathers did before them, use these extraordinary communications tools to capture the hearts and imaginations of new generations of young people for the sake of Allah and His Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam. So that's my 2 cents worth. In follow-up, there have been some changes. You have. I mean, Dr. Sheikh Ali Guma, for example. I served as a consultant to him for a while. I mean, it was an informal relationship, but he took it very seriously because he was being attacked in the press consistently. I think there were 6 negative stories every day about him. And one of the problems he had was that he said, I hate the media. He didn't know, and they're perfectly hateable, many of the journalists. They're very secular, they're ignorant, they're nasty, and so on. And one of the stories that came out, we were looking at it, and it was really nasty. It claimed that he was at a gathering, and he said something very vulgar, and it was in a headline. And I went to him. I said, "Did you say this?" He said, "I didn't say that. I wasn't even there." I mean, they're just lying about him, And so he had contempt for them. And I said, "Look, you need to make these people your allies. You need to bring them close to you, not push them away." He gave a press conference once. He answered some questions. He said, "I'm busy now," and he walked off the street. I said, "You can't do that." He really didn't like them, and I said, "Look," and he said, "I don't care what they say about me." I said, "That's not the point. You represent the iftah. If they attack you, they're attacking the Mufti of Egypt. So you have to represent." So anyway, the long and short of it was that he started listening, and there was he was on his way to Cambridge to give a talk to Anglican clergy in a forum. And they showed me his speech. And, it was a typical kind of speech. It was Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I said, okay. And then he said, Islam means peace. I said, stop. Stop right there. He said, why? What's wrong with that? I said, well, 2 years before, mass murder was committed on the public transport system in London in the name of Islam. They're not going to believe you. You can't do that. And then later on he referred to the day of rising, the Yawm al-Qiyamah. I said, cut that. He said, Allah. He said, these are religious people. They don't believe in the Yawm. I said, yes, they do, but it just makes them uncomfortable. That's not. And anyways, we went through the whole speech. And I tore it apart. But he was a brilliant man. And basically what I said was, you need to go in hard against, you have to repudiate terrorism and violence, going in, because that's what they'll understand. And you'll get the audience that way. He does. It's just that he was used to using a certain form of address. And it was I was really impressed because we sat down and he recorded off the cuff, from his head. It was perfect. It was letter perfect. And it made a huge impact. And the second time he was invited to Cambridge, he was supposed to talk to Muslim leaders. And again, it was like very soft and everything. I said, no, don't be soft. Be rough. Be really hard. And attack them. Go on the attack immediately and say, you have lost the youth, it's your responsibility, and that sort of thing. And he did. And the outcome was that the headline in the Times for the story was The Wise Mufti. And he was on the dais with Tony Blair. And the journalist said, Tony Blair should be listening to him, should be listening to the Mufti, because he went right at them and he said, what you need is institutions of learning that bring qualified people, and there should be localized iftah, in these countries. He gave some positive feedback. But anyway, by the end of the time that I was working with him, the number of negative stories that appeared in the press went from 6 per day to 1 per week. He's always had enemies and that sort of thing. So there are people. Sheikh Ali is one. He's a very positive. He's done some things. I mean, his alliance with the ruling party and with Sisi has made him a lot of enemies, and a lot of people are upset about that. And I had nothing to do with that. And also another example I think is Sheikh Ali Guma. Habib Ali Jifri. He's a very traditionally trained scholar. I don't think it's in his nature even to go out into the media, but he's recognized how important it is. And I was in Bradford recently, and he launched a book of a friend of mine, of Peter Sanders, this wonderful book. And before that, he had a kind of it wasn't a debate at all. It was a talk with an Anglican archbishop, I think. And it was just beautiful. It was so sweet, and he has this wonderful presence. And we need more people out there like that who have a foundation of knowledge, but who aren't afraid to go in front of a camera or talk to people. You have people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and you have Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. They're very articulate, and they speak to their Western audiences, and it's tough. Both of them have been attacked repeatedly by people who are hostile to whatever they believe in, but they've stood up and they've basically they've changed the narrative to a certain extent, and we need more of that. What I don't see the institutions of Islam like Al-Azhar. I don't think they're changing at all. And I'll give you an example. In the first peace forum, I don't know if this is being recorded. Is this going to go out on YouTube or something? Okay, don't put this. But the Sheikh of Al-Azhar University gave the keynote address, and this was a conference that was supposed to be on peace, on bringing Muslims into a frame of mind where they're not hostile to the West. They're seeking to outreach and peace, and his address, his keynote address, basically said, it's all because of the UN. We're in this situation because of the United Nations. And I was with a journalist who, a veteran journalist, and we were listening to this. He said, this is like something Nasser would have said in 1956, And I know he is a very great scholar. There's no question. But this is a problem, and fortunately, I guess, it wasn't an event that was covered by the world media or anything, so nobody picked up on it. But it was kind of shocking. His address was preceded by the address of the Minister of Interior. I think it was the Minister of Interior who was responsible for this peace forum. And it was beautiful what he said. It was very conciliatory. And so there are people trying to do this, but I think institutionally we have a real problem. And I don't know what it's like here, but this has to change. We have to change the whole system of approaching this. And I'd be interested in any in hearing from you now, I've kind of said my piece.